Zaki his son is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Welcome to Nostalgia Theater. This is Zaki Hassan. I'm here with my recurring special guest, my de facto second chair, Glenn Greenberg. Hi, Glenn.
Hello, Zaki. How are you?
I'm here to talk about your latest bookazine. I actually just picked it up from the Target store, not more than an hour ago. So people listening can't see it, but
Yeah.
you can hear it.
You have my eternal gratitude.
It is the story of Batman, and I feel like this is appropriate because last time I had you on, we were talking about Superman.
Yes.
And what better way to follow that up when than to talk about the other half of the world's finest duo?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I see this as sort of like the perfect bookend to the Superman book, kind of like the same way my Paul McCartney book was a bookend to the John Lennon book. So it really was. There was a lot of familiarity and a lot of sort of deja vu working on the Batman book after working on the Superman book.
So Batman and Superman are kind of like the Lennon and McCartney of the superhero set, aren't they?
You can, in a fashion. I think you can make that case.
So first of all, before we even start talking about Batman, how many bookazines have you done now?
I think either 13 or 15.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when I think about it. It's only been about 3 years since I started doing it, and the variety of topics. Although 4 of them were were Beatles related.
Sure.
But other than that, the range.
But I'm sure that must have been just torture for you to have to write about the Beatles repeatedly.
There's so many times you can listen to Revolution 9, but the topics have been so varied between Star Trek and Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Stan Lee, Spider-Man got one all to himself. So it's been a really nice variety of topics, and I had really wanted to do Superman, and so when I got that done, and that came out terrific. I think that's one of the best ones I've done. It was only natural for me to do Batman.
Well, so the question, and this is not in terms of why you did this, but a broader question, and you can choose to answer it in any number of ways. Why Batman? Why is Batman so beloved?
That is a great question. I mean, that's it was a question that came up actually when I was working on the Superman book, which was, is Superman still relevant? And can he still be relevant in the world that we're living in now? And because there's no question that question does not apply to Batman. Nobody questions whether Batman is still relevant.
Mm-hmm.
He's the big man on campus. He's basically DC's biggest gun. Some would say he's DC's only gun at this point. And you would see, you'd be forgiven for thinking that looking at DC's output. It's so driven towards Batman.
Yeah.
And Dan Jurgens, when I interviewed him for the Superman book, he kind of put he kind of really hammered it home for me in a way that I'd never really thought about it before. Is Superman is who we'd like to be, but Batman is who we are. And it's a lot easier, and it takes a lot less effort and a lot less thought and a lot less work on our part to just be already who we are rather than be who we'd like to be,
Sure.
and in the sense that no, not everybody can bring themselves to the peak of physical perfection the way Bruce Wayne did. But Batman is driven by well, let's talk about what Batman is driven by. He's driven by anger. He's driven by frustration. He's driven by a need for not so much vengeance, but certainly a need for justice. And that's something that applies to all of us. Um, Especially those of us who have been through trauma, serious trauma, victims of crime. What do they want more than anything else? They want justice to be served. And in that sense, he's as much of a wish fulfillment character as Superman, just in a slightly different way, in the sense that bullets don't bounce off his chest and he can't fly. But he goes out and he does what we'd all like to do if we had the means, which is find trouble where it exists and beat the hell out of it and make whoever's responsible for that evil regret even thinking about committing it, you know? And that's always going to be relevant. You know, it's like the Punisher was the big deal in the 80s and I would say into the mid 90s. But he was such an extreme character that eventually that fad died down.
Yeah.
And so people still like the Punisher, and he's always being brought back in one form or another. But Batman has never really gone out of style. I would say over the last 6 decades or so, because he walks that fine line between being nothing more than a revenge automaton and being this compassionate being who, yes, he's tough. He can be very, very harsh, but in the end, he's doing it so that nobody has to suffer what he suffered. Nobody has to go through what he went through. And at his core, he is a compassionate being. He is a hero. Whereas Frank Castle is just about revenge. He's just about he's just the and that's the main difference. And that's a point that I tried to really bring home in the book, is that Batman is not driven necessarily by revenge. He's driven by a need for justice. And that just makes him incredibly relatable. And yes, you could say he fell out of favor all across his history. I know there are people who are probably listening to this thinking, well, there were times where Batman fell out of favor. Sure. But they were always able to course adjust without changing the core of who the character was.
Well, and as we're talking, I'm looking at the cover of the bookazine, which admittedly, I'm assuming you didn't have a hand in designing it, but
no.
Nonetheless, and for those listening, we got Lego Batman, we got Christian Bale as Batman, we got 92 animated Batman, we have Adam West and Burt Ward Batman, we have George Clooney Batman, we got Robert Pattinson, and what looks like a drawing by Tom Lyle, I think.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. From the comic books. And then of course right there, dead center, my personal favorite Batman, Michael Keaton. And for me, I think that cover tells us a lot, which is that there are so many different incarnations that you can label Batman, and there's a wide spectrum of interpretations as long as they preserve the core, which you talk about, which can be defined as narrowly, as broadly as people want. I mean, I think that's part of the character's consistent renewal, is you can have on the same cover, you've got Adam West and Robert Pattinson, but they're both Batman.
Right. And either one of them could end up, fighting aliens or ending up on the planet, Zurin R, or jumping into the either the furthest reaches of time or back thousands of years in time, like Batman did in the 50s and the early 60s, and they would still be Batman. The core of the character, the surroundings and the trappings may have changed with the times, but Batman remained fairly consistent throughout his history.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about, you know, the difference in perception between Superman and Batman, I say this all the time. I'm like, Superman's my favorite. He'll always be my favorite. But just being realistic, yeah, Batman is DC's big one. Um, and for me, I would, obviously you have the 60s television show, but really I point to 89 to now. That position at the top of the DC heap has never really been challenged.
For sure. For sure. There's no question about that. Um, 89, I mean, Superman was as a media figure,
Mhm.
Superman was definitely in a down period.
Yeah,
Uh, that last Christopher Reeve movie was an embarrassment. And I'm not saying it to be, like, funny or just to pile on. It was an embarrassment. It was a movie that the people involved with it lost faith fairly early on,
right.
and DC couldn't really get behind it because I think they knew it was going to be a disaster. And this was, in the wake of the John Byrne revamp, which did bring a lot of attention and success back to the character. This movie did not help. This movie
Yeah,
came within a year of the big reboot. Um, but Superman, the Superman comics themselves were at that time were fantastic. I mean,
yeah.
that was, pound for pound, that was probably the best line of comic books being published in that area. But you put forth this Batman movie, this 1989 movie directed by Tim Burton with Nicholson and Keaton, um, and it was a juggernaut.
Yeah.
Now, I am not as much of a fan of the film as you are.
Right.
A lot of it probably has to do with the ages that we were,
That's exactly it. Yep.
when that movie came out. I was a little older. I was in college. I had been waiting for a serious Batman movie for many, many years. And I thought it was a beautiful looking movie, but I thought it was a Joker movie. I thought it was a Joker movie guest starring
Sure.
Batman.
Absolutely.
And I remember, I mean, I remember that night. I went opening night. This was a big effing deal. I
Hmm.
mean, this was, I coordinated with my friends. I was home from school, and my friend went and got the tickets he got a whole block of tickets for all of our friends. And my girlfriend came in from Long Island, and we all went. It was like we went, like, it's like almost like a caravan. I mean, to see this movie, it was a pilgrimage opening night. And once the movie was over, I was walking out of the theater and I turned to my oldest friend who I had to see this with. And I said, "Is it me, or was this kind of a disappointment?" And without even batting an eye, he said, "That's not you," you know? And, and so, for me, here's what I can tell you. If Batman Begins was the movie that we'd gotten in 1989, that would have had the kind of impact on me that The Empire Strikes Back did, or
Sure.
or Star Trek To the Wrath of Khan, or 1989 Batman had on you. That would have
Well,
been a life-changing experience for me.
I mean, it's funny you say that because and I've said this before on the other show. I remember watching. First of all, it's like I always say this. Like I was 9 going on 10 when Batman came out, the 89 movie. So for me, the movie is off to one side. It was the experience of being in the midst of just this hype juggernaut, and we can talk about crass commercialism, whatever. All I know is everywhere I went, Batman was there,
Sure.
t-shirts and buttons and you name it. And it was exhilarating. But I will say, because I didn't end up watching the film itself until a couple months later via bootleg, because I was living in Saudi Arabia at the time. But I remember watching it, and I did like it. I still like it. But and I said it then. I said it was good, but I wish we would have seen how he trains and everything that leads up to. I wanted something like Superman the movie. I said this back when I was 10. And so Batman Begins was literally the movie I was waiting for, since then. So you and I are actually not that far apart in that regard.
What a
But
surprise.
yeah, it's true. You know, but that being said, I have such a strong hold in my heart for specifically the two Burton films. Uh, just because of sort of being able to partake of just the full court marketing press,
Hmm.
and Batman Returns too, man. Summer of '92. I
92.
remember going to eighth grade and having the Trapper Keeper and the notebooks and all the action figures and stuff. And like even you can see in the room that we're recording in, there's my Batman
Yep.
89 stuff there, and I
Yep.
always say like for me the merch, it's the 89 merch that's going to have the deepest well of affection in my heart. But I think that's the great thing, honestly, is like it's easy to get precious and be like, oh well, this is the right one or whatever. And I'm like, Batman divests you of that because it's like everybody gets to pick theirs. And
Sure.
say, and I see that with my kids because I got a few of them, and just the range, some of them love the Dark Knight trilogy, some of them love Ben Affleck, like
Hmm.
those are the Batmen of their lives,
Sure.
and I think circling back to what I was saying before, I think that's part of the reason why Batman is able to transcend in a way that Superman has difficulty in, because I think that there's just a bigger box for what we can expect from Batman, whereas Superman is to some extent boxed in by the expectations of the character. And I think actually related to that, and we probably talked about this last time, I just think Christopher Reeve has such an outsized hold in people's imagination when it comes to Superman, and I don't think that's the case with Batman.
Um, well, I think part of that is because Batman wears a mask. So
Yeah,
you can,
that's true.
you're not so locked into the face of the actor who's playing him necessarily
Yeah.
the way you are with Superman. Um, they tried to get around it as much as possible by having Michael Keaton take off that mask as much as possible, which is why I was really impressed and I admire Robert Pattinson for wearing the cowl
Mm,
as much as he did in the
yeah.
Batman. And
Yeah.
it was like, yeah, he's playing Batman, or the Batman actually.
Hmm.
And I love the fact that he wasn't so hung up on, well, I'm an actor. They need to see my face. So you didn't see all these contrived moments like in those Marvel, the MCU Spider-Man movies, where every 2 seconds Tom Holland is pulling off the Spider-Man mask. You know, um, it gets frustrating because is he playing Spider-Man, or is he not? If he's playing
Yeah.
Spider-Man, when he's Spider-Man, he should be wearing the damn mask.
And and
And
and I mean, to be fair, Tom is not alone because Toby and Andrew Garfield,
sure,
each of them, I mean, it got to the point where it's like, dude, everybody in New York has seen your face at this point,
right, right. It was, yeah, it got ludicrous. But I think also, I think that Christopher Reeve, I can't ascribe anything to it other than magic. I mean, he was just
Yeah.
magical in that role. And listen, I mean, I grew up when Christopher Reeve was new as Superman. I had a whole bunch of people saying to me, "Oh, he's no George Reeves. George Reeves, now that was Superman." Um, and for an entire generation, almost, I mean, that George Reeves was the Superman. I think part of the problem is that we haven't gotten anybody since Christopher Reeve who put as much thought
Yeah.
into playing that character as he did, where he differentiated Clark and Superman to such an extent where you can believe that they are, that people would be fooled that
Yeah.
that they're two different people. Um, I think part of it is number one, again, that not as much thought was given to it. And the other most prominent actors never had a chance to really show what they could do. Poor Henry Cavill,
He
poor
got
Brandon
hosed.
Routh,
Yeah,
both of
both
them,
of them. Yeah.
got hosed. With Batman, I think the understanding is, Bruce, and I think Christian Bale and Ben Affleck really nailed it.
Hmm.
Where Bruce Wayne, when he's out in public, is nothing more than a role. He's a
Right.
character.
Right.
When Bruce Wayne is alone in the Batcave with Alfred, that's the real guy.
Right.
And when he has the mask on and he's out, pounding villains, that's kind of a put on too.
Yeah.
That's probably closer to the real guy than public Bruce Wayne. But the real Bruce Wayne is in those quiet moments with Alfred, and I think Christian Bale and Ben Affleck were terrific at doing that.
Yeah.
And but I it's whereas like Adam West, I know how beloved Adam West is, but his approach to playing Batman wasn't all that different from his approach to playing Bruce Wayne.
Right. Yeah, I think it's funny because obviously I grew up watching the syndicated reruns of the William Dozier series, and I always
As did
say
I.
I remember the first time I heard about the '89 movie. I was on a airplane, we were flying to the States to visit that summer, and I was like, I miss the pre-internet days of like you can just be surprised by something. And I remember seeing it was the picture of Batman. It's a medium shot of him at Axis Chemical, and he's shooting his grapnel, and just my eyes nearly popped out of my head. I couldn't believe it. But what I remember most is going to the store and seeing they were selling consumer posters, and it was the famous shot of Keaton standing in front of the Batmobile, and it says
Yep.
Michael Keaton Batman, and I was
Yeah.
like, Michael Keaton, who the hell? Adam West is Batman. I
Right.
was adamant, and of course, that's that moment of being a little kid and realizing that, oh, wait, these can be played by multiple actors. But what Adam West does, and it's truly like only as an adult I realize now, is he does the character the courtesy of playing it totally straight,
Yes.
and it is uproariously funny.
Right.
But he, as surely as Christopher Reeve played Superman straight, Adam West played Batman straight.
Right.
And
And
and that's
and
why that show still works.
and I get into it in the book a little bit, but I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing, Adam
Yeah,
West. He
yeah,
read the pilot script, and he knew exactly what they were going for, and that he had to play Batman completely straight uh, uh, and not react to all the craziness around him and the
yeah,
comedy around him.
yeah,
So I give him credit for that, and for what it was. I mean, listen, that's how I first got into Batman, was through the TV series. As
yeah.
a 5 or 6 year old, it was the greatest thing in the world. I mean, it was. I looked forward to watching it every single day here in New York when they broadcast it on in the afternoons on Channel 11. Um, it was fantastic. It was you know it appealed on two different levels. To the
Yeah.
6 year old, it's the greatest thing ever in creation, and to the adult, it's one of the funniest things you've ever seen. So it
Exactly.
worked on those two different levels. Um, but when I got older and I got into the comic books, and I saw how other people reacted to the TV show, and I kind of fell into line with them, saying that the TV show was the worst thing that could have ever happened to Batman, because for an entire generation of people, that's how they thought of Batman. As
Biff, pow,
right,
zam.
and constant zingers and camp, and not to be taken seriously, something to be ridiculed
Yeah,
to a certain extent.
right.
And so I became a diehard Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams Batman, Steve
Hmm.
Englehart, Marshall Rogers. That's the way I wanted Batman to be, and so that's definitely what I gravitated to the point where when Frank Miller came along and did The Dark Knight Returns, that was too extreme for me. I was not a huge fan of The Dark Knight Returns, and I
That's
felt very
interesting.
much, yeah, I felt very much like a man on a shrinking island, because I saw where the um, the tide was turning, and people really gravitated towards The Dark Knight Returns, and my take was that's not Batman to me.
Hmm.
I would much rather read the Steve Englehart run again, or the Len
Yeah.
Wein run, or the Jerry Conway run. I didn't recognize that version of Batman, and I
In the
appreciate.
sense, just for people who haven't read the comics, in the
Yeah,
sense that the runs that you're referring to, there's a heavy focus on detective work. He's not a sociopath.
right.
He's relatively well adjusted considering what he
Yes,
does, and
that more than
whereas
anything. That
and
more than
whereas
anything.
the Dark Knight Returns was I mean, that label didn't exist at the time, but it's an Elseworlds of like, oh, this is, what Batman would be like as an old man. I'll let you finish your point, but just I
Sure.
will say that when it comes to the Dark Knight Returns, I've basically found my way to where you are, if only because I see what Frank Miller does next, and
Mhm.
and it I I'm I'm gobsmacked by his continuations of the Dark Knight storyline. I find it just not in any way what I want out of this character. And it's like, well, it starts with the Dark Knight Returns.
Absolutely. Again, I mean, I was there when this book was coming out, and it just to me it I accepted the fact that it was set in a possible future. So I was like,
Mhm.
okay, fine. As long as it doesn't impinge on the current day Batman, I can accept that, that this is a possible future for him, but cross my fingers, it doesn't, this is not where he ends up. This is not what's
Mhm.
going to happen to him in the future.
Right.
Um, and but yeah, there were a lot of idiosyncrasies in that story that just rubbed me the wrong way. You know, Selena Kyle becoming a madam,
Right.
and I didn't get his whole take on the Joker, and I didn't get his take on Two-Face, and Batman is just so remote as a character. He was just hard to. I always felt like I knew Batman. I always felt like I understood Batman when Len Wein was writing him, when Denny, when Steve Englehart more than anybody else, Jerry
Yeah.
Conway for crying out
Yeah.
loud, and Doug Mensch was writing the regular books at that time.
And
I
here
wasn't
we're talking mid early to mid 80s.
86, 85,
Okay.
86.
Okay.
I wasn't as enamored of Doug's first run on Bat. I much preferred his second run,
Yeah.
but still, he was a character that I felt I understood and liked as a person. He was
Right.
basically at his core a nice guy, a pretty
Right.
well adjusted guy. Whereas Frank Miller had him as just demented, like deranged,
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
much. And I didn't like that portrayal. The problem was that um, once the Dark Knight became so popular, the message that DC took from it is this is the way Batman has to be across the board. This is
Right.
how Batman has to be portrayed in the present as well. I much preferred as a reading experience. I much preferred Batman Year One. I thought that was a much
Yeah. I agree with you.
that
Yeah.
yeah.
And I
I
think
thought
it
that
still holds up. Yeah.
yes. It wasn't until let's put it this way. I was a real continuity nut when I was that age. I mean, if you violated the continuity, I really held it against you. And it wasn't until like, you know, well after I finished reading Year One
Mhm.
that it finally hit me. Oh, wait a minute. How does Batgirl fit into all of this? Because
Sure.
if Jim Gordon and his wife are expecting their first child, although they never said it was his first child, but
Right.
they're expecting this child and it's a boy. Where does Barbara fit into all this? But while I was reading Year One, I enjoyed it so much that it didn't come out as a red flag to me. Whereas if the story wasn't as good as it was, that probably would have been one of the first things that I thought of. So I much preferred Year One. Again, once, and I think I actually was talking to Jerry Conway within the last few years, and we were talking about Batman, and boy, did he hit the nail on the head, which was Frank Miller's Batman was Frank Miller's Batman. That
Mm.
was his take. The problem came up when other people started to do Frank Miller's take on Batman.
Right.
And what you've got now is other people doing one man's version of the character, but not as well.
Right. Yeah. This admittedly, I mean, I haven't read the comics regularly in, close to 20 years at this point, but definitely into the 90s. And we're talking, once it was like one event after the other, you had Nightfall and
Mm-hmm.
Contagion and No Man's Land, etc. The sort of, the my city, this is my city type of stuff that started to rub me wrong because I was like, it sort of, it it defies logic in terms of his characterization. Like at one point there's like the earthquake that hits Gotham and the Justice
Yeah,
League show up. They're like, "Hey, dude, like you want some help?" He's like, "No, stay out of my city." It's like
right.
that's insane.
Yeah,
That does,
yeah.
you know?
Well, I'll tell you where it really started for me, where my lifelong love affair with Batman really started to sour, to the point where I don't know if it's probably been almost 20 years since I've really followed Batman. Yeah, it's getting there. It's getting to 20 years.
Yeah.
It's more like whenever New 52 began. What was that?
Okay.
Like 10 years?
2011.
Okay, so for 13 years now.
Yeah, geez.
But even before that, when they started telling all these stories, like filling in the past,
Hmm.
they did a story somewhere where Batman me and Robin, Dick Grayson Robin, they shows the story of how the three of them met the first time.
Okay.
And Robin is all enamored of Superman, like, oh my God, it's Superman. It's he's so cool and everything like that. And Batman privately says to him, you know, never forget, he's not one of us. Don't ever
Mm,
trust him. So
wow.
now he's a xenophobe too, on top of
All
everything
right. Yeah,
else.
yeah. He's he's a
He's never
he's a MAGA guy.
he's not one of us, and he never will be. Don't
Mm,
trust him.
wow.
Superman.
Yeah.
Batman say, I mean, look, I get, it's like I get how it probably would be in the real world, but we're not reading a story set in the real world. It's the
Yeah.
DC universe.
Yeah.
Superman is, you know, above reproach,
Yeah.
and to have Batman of all people, the number, the other guy, the other part of that duology there, the other side of the coin, and plus telling basically the equivalent of his son, you
Yeah.
know, to take this guy who is this paragon of hope and virtue and morality, don't trust him because he wasn't born here. And I was like horrified by that. And I was
Yeah.
like, if this is now the way they're saying that Batman always was, I can't be on board for this. And so that
Hmm.
slowly started to chip away at my allegiance
Yeah.
to following the adventures of that character. But I don't want to turn into a DC bashing session. But I'm
No.
just talking about portrayals of the character,
Yeah.
and how it shifted in the way. And the funny thing is I think a lot of people took the wrong lessons from The Dark Knight. Frank Miller wasn't saying that Batman and Superman were never friends to begin with.
Yeah.
In The Dark Knight Returns, what Frank Miller was saying was that in the years since they were in their respective primes, when they were it in the DC universe, things changed between them.
Yeah.
Batman became more of a rogue, and Superman became more of a sort of like not a tool of the government, but became more of an authoritarian figure, or more of a I'm trying. What's the word I'm thinking of? He just became more of a conformist,
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas Batman became more of a rogue, and that's where the split happened between them, to the point where by the time of Dark Knight Returns, they're really on opposite sides. And yet, spoilers, folks, sorry for a 40-year-old story, but at the end of the story, Superman knows that Batman's still alive,
Yeah.
and he doesn't do anything, to sort of expose that. He's basically giving Batman a passive pat on the head,
Yeah.
a passive nod, because they are friends. But what happened was a lot of subsequent writers took the cue. Oh, they were never friends. They've always been at odds with each other. They don't like each other. And no,
Yeah.
that was part of the tragedy of Dark Knight Returns, was that this was a friendship that had gone wrong.
Yeah.
You know, uh, sort of like Lennon McCartney.
Wow.
You know,
I think that in the wake of the Dark Knight Returns, uh, you know, what the post-crisis setup, which ignored, all the decades of world's finest, and
yeah,
it reset them at more of an adversarial place. But
right.
in Man of Steel, whatever it was, number 5 or 6, number 5, I think, um, where he has Batman and Superman, their first like post-crisis meeting. What I
Right.
like is that, there's a begrudging admiration for each other, but more importantly, you see that relationship grow, and
Right.
the Dark Knight over Metropolis, which was I think
Oh,
1990.
yeah.
You have Superman gives Batman kryptonite,
The
and he's like,
kryptonite
I
ring.
want the means to stop me. I want them to be in the hands of someone I trust with my life. And it means something because at that point, we had been on that journey over the last 4 or 5 years as their
Yes.
relationship grew, and so I think that's really crucial. And I will say, like, it was something that, like, I'm not a fan of Batman versus Superman the film, but at the end of Zack Snyder's Justice League, or even just the theatrical cut of Justice League, seeing Clark and Bruce together as friends, I remember feeling like,
Yeah.
oh, we got here finally. Like, I'm glad, you
Hmm.
know. And so I think just fundamentally, I actually did not know about sort of Batman warning Robin in that manner. And I just even if he doesn't know Superman, I refuse to accept that he would view him that way. If he is the world's greatest detective, he would know very soon whose side Superman is on.
Right.
He would
Right.
know well before he met him, you know?
Right. Right. I agree. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Dark Knight over Metropolis, because if you didn't, I was going to. Um, and yeah, I mean that to me, I mean, that was the Superman team kind of pushing back against the the um the trend to make
Hmm.
Batman and Superman um adversaries, or have a
Hmm.
more adversarial relationship. And I
Yeah.
think they were well on the way to setting them up as, it's definitely not as close as they
Yeah.
were pre-crisis, but definitely two people that don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but can call each other friend.
Yeah.
And I loved that, and I got a chance to speak to, I mean, Roger Stern and I have become, friendly over the years, and he and I were talking about that story, and um, I asked him, I said, how come did you ever have any interest in writing Batman? And he, as I recall, he wasn't really interested in writing Batman on a regular basis, but he felt that if he ever did write Batman, and he pulled out, we were at his house, he pulled out Dark Knight over Metropolis, and he says, "This is how I see Batman." And it was the line where Superman says, "Some people think that the Batman is crazy." This is Superman talking to Batman. He
Hmm.
says, "I see the Batman as a very sane man in a very crazy world." And Roger said, "That's how I see Batman." And I said, "Well, you should be writing Batman." but, but yeah, I mean, that to me was a real pivotal storyline, and it's a favorite of mine, because it really it said everything it needed to say about those two characters. And if they wanted to take it back to pre-crisis relationship where they were like brothers, I mean, they were like the closest of friends. Where if you had to choose who is Batman's best friend, you have a hard time choosing between Dick Grayson or
Hmm.
Superman. And
Yeah.
they were at the point at the end of Dark Knight over Metropolis, they could have easily gone in that direction after that.
Mm. See, and I think that it's impossible to separate what the comics were doing with what was happening in terms of the outsized media presence of the character during the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But now I know you mentioned being a little more tepid in your reaction to the Tim Burton films. I'm curious, what did you think of Batman Forever when that film first came out?
I saw it opening day. Um, I went with a bunch of folks from Marvel, so take that, take that into account, because I was a Marvel guy at that point. Um, I was underwhelmed. I thought that um, I, you know I, one of my biggest problems was they turned it into a Jim Carrey vehicle,
Yeah.
and they clearly wanted to use the Joker again, but they couldn't. So they turned Two-Face into the Joker, and they basically let Jim Carrey take over the movie with doing his best Frank Gorshin impression.
Sure.
And for me, it was like, okay, I could see where they're going with this. They're steering it back towards what Michael Uslan, the executive producer of all of the Batman movies since 1989, they were taking it back to exactly what he was trying to get away from.
Right.
And so that
Yeah.
was my reaction. I thought that Chris O'Donnell was decent as Robin. I thought he was good. I thought they made some clever explanations for why he's wearing that red and yellow and green outfit. I thought that was clever. That was clever. I thought it was clever why he chose the name Robin for himself,
Right.
taking it away from the whole Robin Hood inspiration. But I thought that was good. But I thought that the silliness was really starting to creep in, and I had problems with Batman Returns. And what happened with Batman Forever was they not only kept a lot of the same problems, but they threw in, a whole bunch of new ones that I would not have wanted to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so it fascinates me because I'll definitely say I like Batman Returns more now than when it came out, and I appreciate it for the fact that it's a very Tim Burton movie. I think it
Yeah,
as a Batman movie, it it's a glass half full situation, but I think it's a beautiful movie. But with Batman Forever, it's obviously it's Warner Brothers trying to course correct, and they bring in Joel Schumacher, who I understand the calculus. Oh, Lost Boys, Sleepwalkers, he had a dark sensibility, and it's just kind of funny to me that he took it as, oh well, I want to make a live action comic book, and he took that in a very specific way, and that's fine. By all accounts, he was a lovely person, so I
yeah,
don't I feel bad like picking on him, but I mean he's acknowledged this. Like I think his approach to the franchise was maybe not the best one, uh, and yet the fact that it succeeded so well. I mean, Warner Brothers is like, oh well, more of this, and they
right.
just sort of steered into whatever happened next. But even still, and again, this is just with the benefit of decades. Um, I look at Val Kilmer as Batman. I look at George Clooney as Batman, and I'm like, you know what? Neither of them are my favorite, but there's stuff they did that I like. There's stuff Clooney did I really liked, honestly, and I just wish he could have been a great. He could have been one of the all-time greats. That's the frustrating thing, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's number one is um, in taking the full blame and responsibility. Joel Schumacher, who I never really thought much of, um, I admire him now for having done that, because he was under a lot of pressure from the
Yeah,
studio, from the toy companies, from all of the tie-in stuff,
yeah,
uh, to do what he did. I don't think he had a strong opinion of Batman one way or the other. I think
mm,
this was a gig for him, the
yeah,
way
yeah,
directing Superman's 2 and 3 were a gig for Richard Lester. He didn't have any
yeah,
passion or love for the material. He was a journeyman
yeah.
when it came to that thing. But he
And
he
and
had
and actually, and if I may,
yeah,
the progression from Superman 2 to 3 is very comparable to the progression from Batman Forever to Batman and Robin.
right, because you had somebody who really didn't have a lot of respect or love or affection for the material. Absolutely,
Yeah,
great point.
yeah,
Um, but that said, he was under a lot of pressure from the studio. And Michael Uslan, who I interviewed for the Bookazine, Michael Uslan said all this to me. He came right out and said Joel Schumacher was a wonderful person, uh, but, but he was under a lot of directives that he had, because they didn't want a replay of Batman Returns. They were not
mhm,
happy with the performance of Batman Returns. It was too dark, too grim. Kids were freaking out. It's supposed to be a family movie. You got all this gruesomeness. Anyway, um, with regard to Batman and Robin, that movie, a year or two, but that movie came out in '97, if I'm not mistaken.
97, 97, yeah.
Okay, my first date with the young lady who is now my wife, On our first date, we were talking about all this, and I said George Clooney is going to be one of the best Batmans we've ever seen. He's going to be terrific. I mean, he's got the charm. He's going to be a great Bruce Wayne, and he'll look good in the and I said I'm really looking forward to this next one. I think he's going to be even better than Michael Keaton was, and all that kind of stuff. To this day, I've never seen Batman and Robin because once it hit theaters,
Yeah.
I smelled the stink from
Mm.
like a mile away. So I was
funny.
like, nah, I'm not going to go see it. Now, I caught maybe 2 minutes of it on HBO once, and it was the scene where Batman pulls out his Batman credit card.
Yep.
And I said, that's all I need to say. And I've never,
I'm out.
I've never seen the movie.
Yeah.
And so the only George Clooney that I've seen as Batman really was in the Flash movie.
That's hilarious. That's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame because so I remember I went and watched that in the theater. And by then it was in the cheap shows in the second run theater, and that's when I went by myself. I just had like
Good
an
for you.
afternoon. And
Yeah.
and what I remember most is sitting there and just wanting desperately to have somebody to make comments to.
Sure.
Because it's just one of those movies. But I've revisited a few times. They did a commentary track for the regular movie film show, and I say this, to this day, I'm like, there's scenes in there where it's like it's Bruce and Alfred, and the plot of the film
Yeah.
where Alfred, it seems like he's going to die, and Bruce is saying,
Yeah.
just I love you, old man,
Right.
for raising us. And
Right.
I'm seriously, I'm like the Bruce and Alfred moments are some of the best ever in any Batman. And I'm like, man, this is and by the way, that was when Clooney was on ER, so he was still doing the head down, eyes up kind of acting that he used to do. And now, I mean,
Right.
Steven Soderbergh very shortly thereafter kind of broke him out of that. And you're like, God, like a year later, if he would have had his chance, who knows what kind of movie it would have been. But anyway, I guess my point is, I think that's the beauty of a character like this is there's so much to pull from. Like nothing is ever the
Mhm.
last word on this character. And a
Right.
great, like, I remember being pissed back in '97. Joel Schumacher killed the franchise, and he said, "Yeah, but if not for that, we don't get Batman Begins 8 years later."
Right.
And what a shame that would have been.
On the same token, though, I mean, as for however I feel about the first two Tim Burton movies, they established a solid enough foundation, and I don't understand to this day why they could not get a Batman series, and I'll add a Superman series as well.
Yeah.
The way they've done James Bond.
I agree.
And the fact of the matter is, it was like what 20 films in before they did a cold hard restart, where they basically wiped out all the continuity and said, here's day one, and with Daniel Craig.
That's right.
20 some odd movies in. You're supposed to believe that, in fact, my wife was just watching it earlier today, that the James Bond who married Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Teresa Bond, who gets killed by Blofeld at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Roger Moore was married to her.
That's right.
Pierce Brosnan was married to her. Timothy Dalton was married to her. The character remained the same, but the actors changed because, otherwise you'd have a 75-year-old Sean Connery running around playing James Bond. So there was no reason in my mind that they could not have taken the same approach with Batman.
I agree.
With Superman.
I agree.
They did what they did. And yes, that approach, we did finally get a Batman Begins. And that's my favorite of the Christian Bale movies, believe it or not. And I love that. But once that was over, and that they gave a hard ending to Batman. That is what I disagreed with. That's what I disagreed with, is that they let Christopher Nolan basically say, well, that's it. No one can play this Batman anymore. And again, I thought they set up a beautiful, wonderful foundation for future Batman movies. And yeah, okay, if Christian Bale doesn't want to do more than 3, all right, well, with the 4th one, you bring in somebody else, but it's still the same Batman. And I just,
and No, I agree. I definitely, and I felt much more strongly about it when it came out. But yeah, I had that same feeling. And what I've said for years, I'm convinced that Christopher Nolan was bound and determined to ensure that Warner Brothers could not do to his Batman what they did to Tim Burton's Batman. And so he just sealed it up,
Yeah,
hyperbaric chamber, tight as a drum. There's no
yeah,
room. You can't do in between stories. You can't do after. It's done. And again, and this is just with the benefit of time because that too is now like 3 Batmans ago. You say, okay, so
yeah.
I guess this is what we're doing. But the other thought is weirdly, I think that seeing what Nolan did with the Dark Knight trilogy, winding back to James Bond, I think that's what gets you No Time to Die with the James Bond
Hmm.
films. And I
Right.
have big problems with No Time to Die. I did not like that movie very much,
Yeah.
but I think that's how you get
You
there. I
and I
think
were
it's a
texting
straight
that
line.
night. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Well, you and I were texting the night that I saw No Time to Die, for like an hour or two. What did you think about this? But and I think you're right because if nothing else, I mean, we saw Tim Burton's reaction to the use of Michael Keaton's Batman in The Flash
Yeah,
and how
yeah, that's a good point. He wasn't
insulted
thrilled. Yeah.
and offended I think he was by that. So yeah, I could definitely see Christopher Nolan not wanting to be in the same position that Burton found himself in. Um, yeah, it's and also about the Superman take that he had, the Nicolas Cage
Yeah.
Superman. He was
I think it was
offended by that too,
I think he was more upset about that than even the Batman stuff, to be honest. Uh,
possibly,
right? Because
possibly.
you didn't even want me to make that movie, and now you're gonna, you know what I
Right.
mean? I can, and
Although,
you
although
know,
I, yeah,
like I was not on board with any of what he wanted to do with Superman, but again, this is passage of time. Now I'm like, maybe I might have wanted to see it. So I don't know. I'm getting soft in
I'm
my
not
old age.
there. Oh no, I'm not. I'm not there. I'm not there. No,
I think
I
for
think
me, I'm all, honestly, I'm like on board with Grant Morrison and just the prismatic age. Look, everything counts. Accept what you want, ignore what you don't. I'm like, you know what? I'll have less Surus, I think, if I take that approach.
uh, yeah, and I was certainly not a fan of Grant Morrison's run on Batman, but in the sense that uh, picking and choosing what applies instead of having a hard and fast, that I've softened on over the years.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, you have to, right? I mean, seriously, it's just like life's too short, man.
yeah, I mean, I don't know what the current obsession with the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh is. I don't understand why that's such a big deal.
Right.
I know that it played heavily into Grant Morrison's
And
run,
Grant Morrison. Yeah, that's the
which I
reason.
did try to read, and I did try to read that run. Um, I think that might have been the last straw, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Was
Okay.
Yeah, for me. Yeah, listen, I mean, at one point I was talking to Denny O'Neil, who was the legendary Batman editor from 1986 to like 2002,
Yeah.
2003, maybe.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him about, all the stuff that I loved about Batman from the pre-crisis days and how it would be great to sort of work that back in, you know. And I could see his eyes kind of glaze over. So, I'm even back then when I was much younger, I was much more of a proponent of just, use what works,
I agree.
whatever
Yeah.
works. Denny was so, once Denny became an editor on Batman, he was so hard and cold about everything that he was dismissing stuff that he had done as a
Yeah.
writer
That's right.
on
Yeah.
Batman. So it was a very different take, and he was a lot stricter than I think I would have been in his shoes.
Yeah, and if I recall, it was during his tenure that it was decided that Batman we don't he didn't know who killed his parents. So they took Joe
Right.
Chill out of it, and there were several things, and nothing was like a deal breaker for me, but I definitely remember these changes sort of as they were happening. I think that was like a 0 hour thing, if I'm not mistaken, where they're like,
Yes, it
oh,
was. It
he
was.
doesn't know who killed us, and I guess ultimately what it comes down to is
Excuse me.
but yeah, no problem. You have all these different interpretations, and the ones that are going to last end up lasting, right? Like we're 30 plus years removed from Batman the animated series, and that one really does tower over so many other incarnations uh
Yep.
as sort of like the definitive boiled down version of this mythos, and even stuff that the show did all by itself. You watch it, you're like, how could it not have always been like this? Whether it's in Mr. Freeze's origin,
Right.
having a Harvey Dent as a presence in the series before he becomes Two-Face and really making that hit.
Right.
I mean, so many, uh, I mean, I'm just like the Clayface episodes. I mean, it's just like they just nailed it. Harley Quinn, which people probably forget that she was introduced in the TV show, in the animated show,
Correct.
and again now it's like no, she's been around since forever, So
Right.
talk briefly about that, about what is the legacy of Batman the animated series, especially now that it's effectively done. Kevin Conroy is gone. And so
Right.
at the Batman animated series era is now over.
I think that first and foremost, you have to take into account the time in which it was produced. And at that time, uh, animation, TV animation, especially stuff that was going to be on Saturday mornings, you had to have um, like a kid sidekick, or some kind of magical, element in there, which is why, for example, in the 70s Batman show, you had Batmite because that's
Mhm.
what, that you had to have that for the kids. And you had to have, like, the Wonder Twins in the Super Friends cartoon. You had to have a moral lesson in every episode, where at the end of the episode the character, talks right to the viewer and says, and the moral of today's episode, kids, was blah blah blah. And that was the mentality back then. And from what I've read, the original plan for Batman the Animated Series was to have a lot of that kind of stuff in there. And the producers, in particular, Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, were really pushing against it. And if I remember correctly, one of the original producers of Batman the Animated Series, really wanted to make it very, very aimed at kids, little kids.
Right.
And you know, they absolutely did not want to go there. And luckily they prevailed, and that producer departed the project early on. But so one of the most important things about Batman the Animated Series was that they were allowed to capture the best elements of the comics and just put that up on the screen. Take the
Hmm.
character seriously, not have to pander to their perceived target audience, and just do the best stories they could possibly do and keep the characters true to themselves, whether it was Batman, whether it was Robin, whether it was the Joker, uh, all of them. Just be true to themselves and faithful to the source material, but also put a new spin on it, to the fact that, like where you said, it seems like it was always like that.
Right.
So that Harley Quinn was always in the mix, or that or that Mr. Freeze always had that origin,
The tragic
uh,
backstory.
with the tragic backstory and all that. That, I think, is probably the most important thing that it brought to the table, was that it was allowed to be the most pure and faithful version of Batman that had ever been produced outside of the comics.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, boy, you watch those first episodes, and you really do feel like you're reading an animated DC comic book. From
Yeah.
the early 70s or early 80s. There was no intergalactic mischievous mascot palling around with Batman. You know, Gleek.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you know.
For me, the episode I always point to is the Two-Face two-parter. And the
Hmm.
at the end of part one, we know that Harvey Dent is scarred horribly, and they're cutting away his bandages, and we cut outside, and you hear this this just grotesque scream from Richard Mall
Yeah.
without seeing him. And I mean, this is a kids animated show,
Right.
and that scream, honestly, as I'm talking to you right now, I can hear it in my head. It's
Hmm.
and I was 12 going on 13 at the time that aired, but it's still to this day just an amazing dramatic thing that happens to be an animation. And then Robin's Reckoning, the showing the origin of Robin, the way they depict
One of my
the flying.
favorites.
I mean, it's tremendous. You show what happens to Dick Grayson's parents, and without seeing their bodies fall to the ground,
Right.
they do everything but that, and
Yes.
it cuts exactly the way it needs to for dramatic energy. And so I mean, it really, we can say, oh, adults could like it, whatever. It was still aimed at kids, but it didn't talk down to kids. It
No,
didn't,
not at all.
and that's why it worked.
Yeah. Also, I mean, that was one thing. Um, for Robin's Reckoning was one of my favorites. I mean, that was
Mhm.
one of my favorite episodes. But for me, about not talking down to kids, I think where it really sort of hit home to me, they did an episode where I think it was the one where the Joker, the Penguin, and maybe it was Two Face, but I think Professor Hugo Strange was going to sell off Batman's identity. It was a riff off of the Steve Englehart run, and they all try to escape on a plane, and Batman brings the plane down, and the door to the plane opens up, and the Joker like falls out of the plane after a very rough landing, and he says things haven't been the same since deregulation. And I thought that was, I mean, what kid is going to get that? But yeah, that said to me, they're not aiming this at kids. Kids don't know what deregulation means.
Right.
And some of the Joker stuff was just freaking hilarious, just
Yeah.
just really really funny. And the other thing, the other legacy that I think is very important that the animated series gave us was Mask of the Phantasm,
Yeah. Yeah. Which
which in
ironic, given that it tanked pretty hard when it came out in theaters, and yet it's had a remarkable afterlife.
yes, and it, for my money, it is still the best Batman movie that's ever been made. The most
Hmm.
solid. I just watched it again with my wife a few nights ago because I had, it had come up in conversation. I said, "Did you ever see Mask of the Phantasm?" She said, "No." I said, "I'm going to rectify that right away." And we sat down and watched it, and boy, does it hold up! And it's even funnier than all the stuff with the Joker was even funnier than I remembered. It's a terrific movie, and I believe Michael Uslan, again, there's that name again, the executive producer of all the Batman theatrical movies since '89. I think it's his favorite as well.
And you can see why. I mean, it really it hits so many of the bases. I did a commentary track on that film with John Trumbull on this show several years back. So I'd
Sure.
encourage anybody listening to check that out. But the moment that most typifies that film, and I think it really gets to the heart of the character, is where he's in love with Dana Delaney's character, and he doesn't know what to
Wow.
do, and he goes to his parents' grave. Yeah. And
Yeah.
he says, I didn't expect to be happy.
To be happy.
I,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be happy because I'm
Right.
betraying my OT. I mean, talk about, like, this is to me like Batman Forever. This is like the plot line. Oh, does she love Bruce or Batman? It's like Bruce Wayne doesn't care about that.
Right.
That
Right.
notion, because this whole idea of him as a fractured psyche, I don't find that interesting. No, he knows exactly who he is.
Right,
Uh,
right.
and
And
he
yeah. And that's why I prefer the writers that I mentioned before, because
yeah,
they understood that.
yeah,
Len Wein, Jerry Conway, Steve Englehart, Denny, um, and just bringing up the only, I do have to say this because I feel it's important, is the only sort of stain that I feel that Mask of the Phantasm has is that it took a lot from Batman Year Two,
oh sure,
and the writer of Batman Year Two never got any credit for it, Mike W.
Mike
Barr,
W. Barr,
because
yeah,
a lot of the character stuff, a lot of the beats and all that, a lot of the concept behind the story came from Batman Year Two, and that was a case where they for some reason, because the TV show had adapted comic book stories straight, and it would say adapted from a story by Len Wein or adapted from a story by Denny O'Neil or whoever. And in some cases, they even got the original comic book writers to write the script for the TV episode.
right.
I think Denny wrote the first Ra's al Ghul episode of the animated series.
Hmm.
I think Len Wein wrote the werewolf story where Batman fought the werewolf.
Right.
Moon of the but here they made a movie that was really took a lot from Batman Year Two, and unfortunately Mike Barr didn't get what I felt was the proper acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I try to do in the bookazine, is to really show just how influential and how important the comics were to all the things that most people who love Batman love him from the movies, the TV show, the comic, the cartoons and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to sort of really explain, the comic books is where a lot of this stuff came from. So let's
Yeah.
not disrespect the comics. So
well,
yeah.
well, in that vein, while we speak about giving credit where due, I don't think we can let this conversation go without first talking about one of Batman's greatest villains. I mean, Bob Kane, and
You're not wrong.
the man who stole credit for solely creating Batman for virtually the entirety of his life. I don't want to talk about him though. I want to talk about Bill Finger and what he brought to Batman, that we
Okay.
wouldn't have if not for his contributions.
Everything? No, I'm no. I'm being facetious, but there's a lot of truth to it, because
Yeah.
I mean, he named Bruce Wayne. He basically took the costume design that Bob Kane gave him and redesigned it into what we know as Batman. Black cowl that covers his face, a long cape with the scallops on the bottom to sort of evoke bat wings, the gray tights. I believe it was his idea to change, because originally Batman operated in New York City. I think it was Bill Finger who suggested changing it to Gotham City so that anybody could identify with that city. It doesn't have to be so specific to one particular place. Bill Finger was a very visual writer, so when he wrote scripts, he thought very visually. So working with artists like especially Dick Sprang, you get those giant props, Batman and Robin fighting gangsters on a giant typewriter or a giant sewing machine, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff came from Bill Finger. Bill Finger played a crucial role in the creation of the Joker and Robin, Alfred, I think the Riddler. I mean, he and more than anything else, he wrote the stories. I mean, at first he was in collaboration with Bob Kane. I mean, I don't want to completely dismiss Bob Kane's involvement, because that wouldn't be fair either.
Right.
Bob Kane was very involved in the first few years, but Bill Finger was writing those scripts in collaboration with Kane, but he was writing the scripts, and a lot of just the tone, the tone of the series, the developments that sort of the evolution of the character over time. A lot of that he was responsible for. And again, the Joker was an important. He made a very important contribution to the Joker, the Catwoman, um, like I said, Robin, Commissioner Gordon, Alfred, all of that. He wrote the stories, not all of them. Gardner Fox was in the mix too in the first year or so, but he was instrumental. And in terms of getting the character to the point where DC was interested in buying him, in taking this character on and publishing him, um, he was instrumental because what Bob Kane was going to go to DC with was not what he ultimately went with after sort of work after showing the idea to Bill Finger. Bill Finger was the one who said, no, he should have a cowl with long ears to evoke a bat and do the gray tights and oh right and originally Bob Kane had Batman wearing like this sort of device that he supposedly saw in a book. It was an illustration by Leonardo da Vinci, which was like this device with these kind of like wings on the back that kind of evoked a bat, and Bill Finger didn't like it, and he just like suggested, have it be a cape with scallops, and when he's running or swinging and all that, it can look like bat wings. And Kane went for all of this stuff, and that's what he ultimately brought to DC, and DC signed off on it. And the biggest thing that Bill Finger had going against him was he wasn't a business-minded guy. He was a creative guy. And so Bob Kane, who was more business savvy, was able to go in and present it as his own work and solely his own work. And so when DC picked up Batman and basically said, okay, do the Batman strip for us, Bill Finger was basically a writer for hire to Bob Kane. He was basically a freelance writer for Bob Kane. DC had no relationship with Bill Finger for the first few years. I don't even think they knew, he was working on Batman because it was all being filtered through Bob Kane.
Yeah.
It was steady work, but he didn't have an ownership stake.
Man, and I mean, look, this is an injustice that at long last has finally been rectified as of, I think Batman versus Superman was the first time that he was credited on screen.
The first time was an episode of Gotham, I believe.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure. Oh, actually, you know what? The first time was an episode of it might have been Robot Chicken.
Is that right? Okay. Wow.
Where they did an episode where there were some Batman elements, and it said Batman created by Bob Kane with Bill Finger, and that was the first on-screen appearance of the new credit, and then yeah, Batman v Superman was the first time on a movie screen.
Yeah, and that's again, justice delayed. But justice at last for Bill Finger and his family, because obviously that credit means everything. It's an acknowledgement of the work that he did. And it took far too long to get there. And look, I don't care. I say it all the time. I think it's unconscionable what Bob Kane did. I can't even wrap my brain around having he had the power to look out for this guy, and he did nothing to do it. And he wrapped himself in this cloak of, oh, but I created Batman. What a great character. Yeah, but the character is a better person than you are.
Oh, without question. And that's one of the things, that's the big difference between this Batman bookazine and any of the other bookazines that I've written, is that it has a through line. And in each chapter, and when I show the evolution of Batman, I try to always insert what the status was of Bill Finger and his role in Batman at that point in history, because it's told in sequential order.
Right.
And so, I talk about his role in the creation, the literal creation of Batman. I talk about the development of the subsequent characters that came along, whether it was Robin, the Joker, and all that. I talk about his involvement in the TV show, that he wrote 2 episodes of the Batman TV show. It was the only time during his lifetime that his name ever appeared in the credits of a Batman story, was because of the TV show. And I get into, especially in the 60s, where Bill Finger was starting to get acknowledgement amongst fandom, his instrumental role in the creation of Batman, and his ongoing role in terms of creating the stories, because he was writing Batman up until the 60s, but up until around the time Julie Schwartz took over as editor.
Mm-hmm.
And even Julie Schwartz kept him on for a little while. And fandom started to acknowledge publicly that Bill Finger was instrumental to the Batman legend, the mythos and everything like that. And Bob Kane just slapped back.
Oh yeah, he went ape shit. Yeah.
To an extent. Oh, we can talk like that? Oh, okay. Sure. All right. Yeah, he went ape shit.
Yeah.
And to the point where he wrote this infamous letter to a fanzine, and I won't. Some of it is quoted in my book, so you can. And just the absolute denial to Bill Finger of any credit. I mean, Bob Kane, who hadn't really drawn a full Batman story since probably 1941, 42, was claiming that he was still writing and drawing all the Batman stories in 1965.
Wow.
So it was ludicrous. It was absolutely ludicrous. And just to sort of jump ahead, because, Bill Finger died in 1974. And in 1989, in his autobiography, Bob Kane claimed that, if he could go back in time to 1974 before Bill died, he would have said, you know what, Bill, you contributed so much, I'll add your name to the credits. I'll finally give you that byline. I'll share the byline with you. So that was what he was claiming in his book published in 1989, that he would have gone back. If he can go back to 1974, he would have done it. But the fact of the matter was, it's all in print. I'm not talking out of school. The guy who co-wrote his autobiography admitted, number one, he had to twist Bob Kane's arm to acknowledge Bill Finger's contributions.
Wow.
And also that it was broached. The subject was broached when they were making the first movie, the 1989 movie. The subject was broached. Bob, how about starting here with the 1989 movie, we had Bill Finger as a co-creator, and he steadfastly refused. Why?
What a guy. Because
the money.
Yeah, of course.
And he was afraid of what that would do to his own legacy.
Amazing. I mean, and it's like, well, his legacy is sealed because Bill Finger's name is on there, and all you have to do is a little bit of digging to know what it took to get his name on there, and there's Bob Kane's legacy. So good job. Pat yourself on the back. He got to live 9 more years being a piece of crap. So
well,
sorry,
we have to thank.
I don't have any affinity for him.
Yeah, I mean, we have to thank a writer named Mark Tyler Nobleman.
That's right.
For really making the case, and we also have to thank Bill Finger's granddaughter, Athena.
Yeah, Athena Finger. Yeah.
Who I also interviewed for the book, and she agreed. I mean, she's a very private person. I mean, she had her own life and everything. But when Mark Tyler Nobleman approached her and said, "Look, this is your family's legacy," and convinced her to basically come out of the shadows and start like the clarion call and tell the story and go to conventions and share with fans the story of her grandfather and this legacy, because her father, Bill Finger's son, isn't around to do it. He died young. She's basically all that's left. So thank goodness, because justice and here's the thing. There were people within Marvel Comics that wanted for years to add Bill Finger's name to the credits, and they just couldn't because of the because of all the legal hassles that they would have had to endure. I know that Mike Barr, who I mentioned earlier, was lobbying, for justice for Bill Finger. I think if he could have, Paul Levitz, when he was running DC, I think he would have been happy to add Bill Finger's name. And I don't know the permutations and the machinations that had to be dealt with to finally get this to happen. I think there was a lot of negotiation on the part of Athena Finger and DC to make it happen. I don't think it was something that DC could just arbitrarily do. Otherwise, again, if Paul Levitz would have made sure it happened back then, Jeanette Kahn as well, I'm sure. If they could have.
I mean,
nothing changed.
I've said it elsewhere that the word "with" in that credit is like a load-bearing structure, because that's somehow I don't doubt that the word "with" is what they had to somehow negotiate to arrive at.
Right.
That being said, hey, we're winding down, but I wanted to end with kind of a lightning round. And this is where I'm gonna rattle off some Batman related characters, and I want your what comes to mind. First reaction when you hear the name. Bruce Wayne.
Cool.
I like it. Jim Gordon.
Loyal.
Alfred Pennyworth.
Even more loyal. Faithful.
Okay. Dick Grayson.
Son.
Jason Todd.
Annoyance.
Tim Drake.
Decent.
Okay. Damian Wayne.
Who?
All right, now we're gonna look at the rogues, just some of the rogues. The Joker.
Overused.
Two-Face.
Potentially great.
Interesting. Catwoman.
Misused.
Interesting. Okay. And Ra's al Ghul.
Too much.
I love it. I'm not asking any follow-ups because I like the tantalizing tease of just where you.
I mean, follow up away. I can.
No,
I
I see where your head's at, and I just kind of I like people to just kind of see wherever that is.
I just think in terms of Catwoman, for example, I just think that there have been so many different takes on her, and so many of them have been, in my opinion, wrong. And that's what I meant by misused.
Yeah.
And just starting with, again, turning her into an ex-prostitute or it's like, where did that come from?
That's very Frank Miller, isn't it?
Yeah. And just in terms of, again, with the Joker and Ross, it's just like, enough already. Enough with the Joker and Ross. I just don't know what else there is to say about them at this point. Put them aside for a long time until you have something really, really great to do with them.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing is that these characters are all part of the Batman's tapestry, and the Batman is not in danger of going away anytime soon. And I think that by itself is a remarkable testament to this character. In the last week or so, there's been all this conversation or even consternation about, what's going to happen when the public domain stuff kicks in for Batman.
Yeah.
And I say, hey, good. More's the pity. This is a character that can even withstand multiple, and that has withstood multiple interpretations all his copyrighted life, and I don't see anything wrong with if there's the ability to tell more stories that are free of copyright. Hey, it's Batman. Batman is Batman.
Agreed, and there's coming out in a couple of months. They're doing a series called Batman. I think it's called Batman First Night, where it's a storyline featuring Batman in the original 1939 Detective Comics number 27 costume. So I think that might be
little copyright. Up.
I think so. I think that's.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Oh, these lawyers are waiting, just lying in wait, just ready to pounce. If once people go even slightly askance,
And there goes my dream of doing a self-published, my own Batman 1939 comic book series. Yeah,
Well, the book is the story of
of
Batman, and this
Batman.
is this is your latest bookazine, and you know, if you make it a regular sidelight where every time you have one of these come out and you pop over and we get to share in the glory of nostalgia theater, well, then that's fine with me.
Fine with me too.
So the book is available right now. Glenn, as always, thanks for being on here. If people are looking for you online, where can they find you?
Um, I've been kind of keeping a low profile lately, actually. I'm not on Twitter anymore, and I keep my Facebook account fairly private. So I'm not really doing social media in an active way right now. But if I have anything to say, Zaki, you'll be the first to know, and you can spread the word for me.
I'll put the Glenn signal in the sky, and hopefully you'll answer the call.
Beautiful,
There we go.
beautiful.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. As always, if you're looking for me online, like Glenn, I'm sort of tapering off my Twitter, but I am still on there at Zaki's Corner, Zakis Corner. I'm also on Instagram and various other places under that same name. Of course, the regular movie film show drops every other week with myself and my partner Brian Hall. If you want to reach out to us, you can email us at moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast, and message us there. As always, if you've got any suggestions for future episodes of the Nostalgia Theater Show, please let us know. But as for this episode, on behalf of my guest Glenn Greenberg, my name is Zaki Hassan. Thank you all for listening. I will catch you next time.